Our getaway to a mountain cabin seemed like the perfect chance to restore the connection we'd lost. Thomas, ever meticulous in his planning, had stocked up on everything we could possibly need, mapped out hiking routes, and even checked the weather forecast. I had hoped this week would help us reconnect, but when he casually mentioned that his younger brother Jason would be joining us, my expectations crumbled. Jason arrived in the evening, and the first thing I noticed was how much he'd changed. He looked more confident, more attractive than I remembered. As soon as he walked through the door, he took off his jacket, glanced around, and smiled. "Jennifer, you look stunning. Thomas is lucky." His words caught me off guard. Thomas was already unpacking our bags and paid no attention to the exchange. "How was the drive?" Thomas asked, still focused on his task. "Smooth, though I had to stop for gas. My car's as thirsty as ever," Jason replied, his eyes still lingering on me. That look stirred something unfamiliar in me. Thomas seemed entirely absorbed in preparations for tomorrow's hike, as though this vacation was more about the routes than about us. Our marriage wasn't bad, but I couldn't help noticing how the passion had slowly faded. More and more, I felt like I was an afterthought. His plans, his work, and his schedules always seemed to come first. He was always caring, but I missed the little gestures that used to make me feel special. "You're really going hiking dressed like that?" Jason's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "What's wrong with it?" I asked, a hint of defiance in my tone. "Nothing. Just saying you might miss the views. Everyone else will be too busy looking at you," he teased with a wink. The compliment made me smile, though it also left me with a strange sense of guilt. Thomas didn't notice, too engrossed in discussing tomorrow's routes with Jason. That evening, as I watched them poring over a map, I realized I hadn't felt like the center of someone's attention in a long time. The morning started with a flurry of activity. Thomas had already spread out the map, explaining to Jason what awaited us on the trail. I was busy preparing breakfast, trying not to pay too much attention to their discussion. Jason occasionally glanced at me, his looks lingering just enough for me to notice, but I said nothing. At lunch, the tension became palpable. Jason, lounging casually in his chair, tossed out comments that made me feel entirely too visible. "Jennifer, that top is perfect for you. Honestly, I didn't think hiking clothes could be this flattering." His voice was light, but there was a teasing undertone. Thomas, engrossed in his phone, didn't even look up. "Maybe I should jot down where you got it. Could come in handy," Jason added, this time flashing a full smile. I pretended not to hear, taking a sip of water instead. But something stirred inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt feminine, desirable, for the first time in ages. While Thomas continued talking about tomorrow's hike, I caught Jason's lingering gazes. They were too long to be accidental. His eyes swept over my neck, my shoulders, pausing on my arms. My heartbeat quickened against my will. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. His voice remained calm and steady, but I could tell he was once again missing an opportunity to connect with me. Day by day, I felt our relationship becoming more routine. The love was still there, but the passion, it simply wasn't. Later that night, I stepped onto the terrace to breathe in the cool air. Jason was already there, a mug in his hand. The dim light from the lamp cast shadows across his face, and his eyes sparkled faintly. "Do you do this often?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Only when I know I'll have someone to talk to," he replied, his gaze unwavering. His easy tone was calming yet disarming at the same time. I felt an unspoken tension building between us. Jason stepped closer and I caught the scent of his cologne. "Thomas is a lucky man," he said suddenly, his voice softer now. I looked at him, trying to read something in his expression that I shouldn't have been looking for. My fingers tightened around the cold edge of the railing. "It's not as simple as it seems," I replied quietly, not knowing why those words had escaped me. His eyes searched mine as if trying to find answers. In that moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. Thomas went to bed early, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat in the living room watching the faint glow of the fireplace embers. When Jason appeared, I glanced at him briefly. He held a jacket in his hand and gave me a small nod, as if suggesting something without words. I didn't want to be alone, so I stood up and grabbed my jacket. We stepped into the cool night air, sharp and crisp against my cheeks. Jason walked beside me, unhurried, giving me time to adjust to his presence. The trail to the lake was slippery from the recent rain. I lost my footing, the ground seeming to tilt beneath me, but his hand caught me instantly. His fingers were warm, his grip steady. For a brief moment, something inside me tightened. He didn't let go of my hand right away, as if holding it was natural. We reached the lake, its smooth surface reflecting the moonlight. I sat on a fallen tree near the water, and Jason lowered himself beside me. His presence was quiet yet overwhelming, filling the space between us. I could feel his gaze on me. It was too direct, lingering too long. In his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in Thomas's in a long time. Interest, genuine admiration. My thoughts were a tangled mess. Why had I let myself come here? Why did his presence make me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel? His hand moved slightly closer, and I felt tension building inside me. At some point, he leaned in, his breath brushing against my skin. It caught me off guard, and I couldn't find the strength to pull away. His lips touched mine faintly, but in that brief contact was a restrained passion. I pulled back sharply, standing up, my cheeks burning. Everything had happened so quickly that I couldn't decide what was stronger, confusion or desire. We walked back in silence. Thomas was already asleep when I slipped into the bedroom. Lying in bed, I focused on his even breathing, but the moment at the lake replayed in my mind over and over. Guilt gnawed at me, but with it came something forbidden, something thrilling that I couldn't fully understand. The next morning, I tried to act as though nothing had happened. Thomas was already immersed in his maps, making notes about the trails. Jason, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. His eyes lingered on me the moment I entered the room. "You look like you were made for mountain getaways, Jennifer. You don't even have to try to look stunning," he remarked as I approached the table in my sports top and shorts. I felt warmth rise to my cheeks, but I didn't let it show. His compliments were personal, almost too much, yet I couldn't deny how they made me feel. Thomas, engrossed in his plans, didn't notice anything. His voice was like background noise, steady and familiar, but easy to tune out. I nodded and hummed in agreement as his words blurred into the hum of conversation. During lunch, I caught Jason's gaze on me more than once. He didn't try to hide it, and I started to enjoy the attention. His looks reminded me that I was still a woman, that there was something in me that could spark someone's interest. Thomas sat across from us, completely absorbed in discussing the upcoming hike. He talked about routes and elevations, but I couldn't focus. Between Jason and me, there seemed to be something invisible growing, intensifying with every passing moment. After dinner, we all gathered in the living room, but the tension stayed with me. I noticed how Jason watched me out of the corner of his eye, tracking every movement. His presence felt heavier, as if the air around him was different. When night fell, I stepped out onto the terrace again. The cold air wrapped around me, calming my restless thoughts. I heard footsteps and wasn't surprised to see Jason appear. "It's quiet here, isn't it?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. We stood side by side, staring at the stars, the distance between us shrinking by the second. "You deserve to be happy, Jennifer," he said at last, his tone almost serious. I didn't reply. His words lingered, echoing in my mind long after they were spoken. When I returned to the bedroom, Thomas was already asleep. His breathing was steady, his face peaceful. I looked at him and tried to understand why his usual care no longer brought me the warmth it once did. The morning started as usual. Thomas was absorbed in his plans, telling me something about routes and the weather. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my thoughts were far away. His voice was familiar, steady, but it failed to reach me. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, making me flinch. I met his gaze and forced a smile. "Of course. Just tired." He frowned but said nothing more. Later during breakfast, I noticed the way he looked at me, as if trying to read my mind. The day dragged on slowly. Thomas was busy with his tasks, and Jason kept his distance, almost deliberately giving me time to process the events of the past few days. I tried to occupy myself with chores to distract my thoughts, but they always returned to one thing: his gaze, his touch, the way he made me feel. Toward evening, Jason and I were left alone. Thomas was occupied on the other side of the house. I was clearing dishes from the table when Jason stepped too close. His hand brushed mine, and I quickly pulled away. "Not now," I whispered, but my voice wavered. "This isn't something you can just ignore, Jennifer," he said softly but firmly. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. His lips were warm, insistent, and nothing like that night by the lake. This time I felt my resolve crumble. I stepped back, my body trembling. "We can't," I began, but the words trailed off. Jason didn't reply, only looking at me as if he already knew I wouldn't resist for long. Later, alone in my room, I sat by the window for what felt like hours. I tried to justify my actions. It's just a fleeting infatuation, nothing serious. But every thought returned to Jason, his confidence, the way he made me feel alive. That evening at dinner, I noticed how Thomas had started watching us more closely. His gaze lingered on me, then on Jason, as though he was trying to catch something that didn't quite fit. He made a few attempts at conversation, but his questions felt superficial, as if he wasn't ready to ask what he really wanted to know. The tension in the room grew almost tangible. When I went to bed, Thomas followed me into the bedroom. "Is everything okay? You seem different," he said quietly. I avoided his eyes, muttered something vague, and quickly buried myself under the blanket. But even lying beside him, I felt torn between guilt and the forbidden feelings that continued to grow stronger. I knew I had to keep my distance from Jason. Every glance, every fleeting touch tangled my thoughts further. But the more I tried to avoid him, the more persistent he became. His presence was everywhere, at meals, on walks, even in the silence of the house. I could feel his gaze on me. That morning, I decided to spend the day away from both men, focusing on small tasks. I took a book and stepped onto the terrace, hoping for some peace. But Jason was already there, as if waiting for me. He said nothing at first, but his silence spoke volumes. "Jennifer," he began at last, his voice low and quiet. I didn't let him finish, raising a hand. We can't." He looked at me with an unreadable expression, as if he could see right through me. I stood and walked away, feeling his eyes follow every step. Thomas had started noticing that something was off. At breakfast, his gaze darted between Jason and me. He tried to dismiss it, but I could see his thoughts beginning to piece things together. "You and Jason seem closer," he remarked one evening when we were alone. "Just talking," I replied lightly, though tension coiled inside me. His words echoed in my mind. Could he already suspect? Or was he just trying to understand why I'd been so distant? That day, Thomas suggested we spend some time together, just the two of us. It was unexpected and touched me in a way I hadn't felt in a while. We decided to go for a walk. Thomas made an effort to talk about things that used to connect us, our first dates, trips we'd taken. I tried to focus on him, but my thoughts kept drifting back to someone else. I felt something breaking inside me. Thomas was my husband, the man I had trusted with my entire life, but now his care felt more like a duty than a genuine desire to be close. Jason, on the other hand, was like the embodiment of freedom. He wasn't tied to routine or bound by schedules. He looked at me as if he saw something in me that I hadn't noticed in myself for a long time. The thought burned within me. I couldn't allow myself to feel this way, but I couldn't suppress it either. That evening, I noticed Thomas watching Jason and me with growing unease. His gaze was becoming more focused, and I knew it wouldn't be long before my emotions betrayed me entirely. I caught myself eagerly anticipating every morning, hoping for a moment alone with Jason. Any chance to be near him filled me with a strange mix of excitement and guilt. Despite my promises to keep my distance, I couldn't shake the desire to feel his presence again. During the day, I tried to focus, helping Thomas prepare for our next hike, but my eyes constantly sought Jason. His fluid movements, his confidence, the look in his eyes that carried an unspoken challenge, all of it blurred the reality around me. One night, I woke to a sound. Jason was in his room moving something around, perhaps packing for the next day. My heart quickened, and an inexplicable urge to go to him surged within me. I knew it was wrong. The thought alone was a betrayal, but something inside refused to quiet down. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself. Thomas lay beside me, his breathing even and calm. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to focus on the present, but the moment only deepened the conflict within me. The next day, we set out on the long-anticipated hike. Thomas led the way, enthusiastically pointing out local plants, but his words sounded distant. Jason walked beside me, his presence felt on an almost instinctive level. When we reached a steep incline, I struggled to keep my balance. Jason extended his hand to help. His fingers brushed my waist, lingering slightly longer than necessary. The touch made me freeze, my breath hitching. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a hidden undertone. I nodded, avoiding his gaze, but that brief moment stayed with me, like an indelible mark. Later, as we made our way back home, my thoughts grew increasingly chaotic. Resisting my feelings had become nearly impossible. I could no longer ignore what was happening inside me. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the evening alone. Thomas went to bed early again, leaving me with my thoughts. I realized I had reached a point where I could no longer pretend nothing was happening. My feelings for Jason were growing, but I didn't know what to do about them. The night was unusually quiet. Thomas slept beside me, his steady breathing filling the room. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My thoughts kept returning to Jason. Everything about him felt like a challenge. His gaze, his movements, the way he spoke. I knew I couldn't resist the pull any longer. Without thinking, I got up. Quietly, so as not to wake Thomas, I left the room and made my way to Jason's door. For a moment, I hesitated, my heart racing wildly. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over his figure. He was lying without a blanket, his chest bare, his face relaxed in peaceful sleep. My eyes roamed over his body, broad shoulders, strong arms, the gentle curve of his stomach. It all drew me in. I moved closer and sat on the edge of the bed. The room suddenly felt warmer. Without overthinking, I slipped under the blanket and pressed myself against him. His skin was warm, and I felt desire stir within me. He shifted, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw me, he smiled, first with a hint of surprise, then with the kind of confidence that made my breath catch. "Jennifer," he whispered, his voice soft but already charged with energy. I didn't respond. Instead, I leaned in and touched his lips with mine. In that moment, I knew I could no longer hide my feelings. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, growing more fervent. I felt us both surrender to the moment, forgetting everything else. My thoughts vanished, leaving only sensation. I pressed closer to him, our movements becoming more urgent, and soon there was nothing left between us but passion. When it was over, I lay beside him, listening to his breathing. His fingers lightly traced my back, and the touch brought a strange sense of calm. "Leaving already?" he asked as I began to rise. I smiled without looking at him. "I'll see you in the morning." I got up, wrapped myself in my robe, and slipped out of the room as quietly as I could. Back in the bedroom, I paused at the door for a moment. Emotions still swirled inside me. A mix of desire, satisfaction, and a faint trace of guilt left me feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. I climbed into bed next to Thomas, the warmth still lingering in my body. Sleep still wouldn't come, but now I was ready to wait for dawn. The morning was tense. I tried to appear calm, but every movement felt forced. Thomas was already in the kitchen, his voice carrying through the wall as he talked about tomorrow's hike. I wrapped myself in a robe and forced myself to join him. Jason was sitting at the table. His gaze caught mine immediately, and I quickly looked away, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks. It felt as though Thomas must sense the hidden tension, but he remained oblivious, absorbed in his own thoughts. I spent the day avoiding Jason. Every time he looked at me or tried to start a conversation, I found an excuse to leave the room, pretending to be busy. Yet, even from a distance, I could feel his presence, and it was maddening. By midday, it became clear that Jason wasn't going to remain silent. He appeared on the terrace where I had retreated with a cup of tea, seeking solitude. I knew I should leave, but his approach froze me in place. "You're acting like we did something terrible," he said softly, leaning against the railing. "We did," I replied, avoiding his gaze. No, we did what we both wanted. His confidence threw me off balance. While I was trying to bury myself in guilt, he openly admitted he had no regrets. The contrast between us unsettled me, leaving me unsure of what to think. Meanwhile, Thomas had begun to notice the strangeness. During dinner, his eyes lingered on me, then shifted to Jason, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. His questions grew more pointed, though his tone remained neutral. "You seem distracted today. Is everything okay?" he asked when we were alone. "Just tired," I replied, avoiding his eyes. Even such a simple excuse felt difficult to utter. His attention grew heavier, almost palpable, and I didn't know how much longer I could endure the tension. Day by day, I felt the growing distance between us. Thomas was there, saying all the right things, but I couldn't summon the same sincerity as before. His care, which had once felt so natural, now only reminded me that I was no longer the woman who burned under his touch. That evening, lying beside him, I felt lost. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine how things might have been different. But instead, Jason's image filled my mind, his hands, his voice, his confidence. It frightened and captivated me all at once. I knew I had to bring everything back to normal, or at least pretend that things were as they used to be. In the morning, I made an effort to stay close to Thomas, helping him with his plans for the day, asking him about the hike. But his responses were brief, as if he sensed the insincerity in my words. We talked about routine things, but every conversation felt hollow. Our words sounded like rehearsed lines, devoid of warmth or meaning. I found myself looking at him, trying to remember the last time we truly spoke to each other. Jason, on the other hand, grew bolder. During lunch, he handed me a glass of water, his fingers brushing against mine. It was fleeting, but enough to send a jolt through my body. Thomas, sitting across from us, noticed immediately. His eyes darted from Jason to me, and I saw something shift in his expression. His gaze hardened, but he said nothing. Later, perhaps trying to reestablish a sense of closeness, Thomas suggested we spend the evening together. He cooked dinner, though cooking had never been his strong suit. I appreciated the effort and decided not to refuse. We ate and talked, but beneath every word I could feel his tension. He was waiting for something, perhaps some kind of authenticity from me that would convince him everything was fine. After dinner, he unexpectedly leaned in and kissed me. His lips were soft, and I felt the warmth of his breath, but nothing more. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the moment, but inside there was only emptiness. This kiss didn't spark the emotions I'd felt with Jason. Thomas seemed to sense it. He pulled back but said nothing. I could see the unspoken question in his eyes, one he didn't dare to voice. By nightfall, his suspicions had deepened. He began watching my movements more closely, noticing every gesture, every pause in conversation. His gaze grew sharper, as if he were trying to uncover what I was so desperately trying to hide. I knew it wouldn't last much longer. Thomas was too perceptive not to see the truth. And every time I avoided meeting his eyes, I felt the lie tearing apart not just us, but myself as well. It had been a few days since that night, but I couldn't get the moment with Jason out of my head. Every time our eyes met, my heart stopped. I tried to keep my distance, to stay closer to Thomas, but it felt like fighting against myself. Desire, despite all the guilt, only grew stronger. That night, I found myself unable to sleep again. Thomas lay beside me, his breathing steady, but I felt I couldn't resist the pull any longer. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and headed for the door. I was sure Thomas was asleep. But as soon as the bedroom door clicked shut, his eyes opened. The suspicions that had been building inside him over the past few days made him alert. Hearing my footsteps retreating down the hallway, he slowly got up and followed me, his movements silent. I reached Jason's door, hesitating for a moment. Inside, my heart raced with both fear and longing, but I pushed the door open. Jason was sitting on the bed, as if he'd been waiting for me. His gaze met mine, and he smiled, that smile that always made my head spin. Behind the door, Thomas crept closer, his heart pounding. He pressed himself against the wall and peeked through the slightly open door. What he saw shattered him. I stepped toward Jason, my movements careful, as if I were afraid reality might wake up at any moment. We didn't say a word. His hands reached for me and I felt all resistance dissolve. Thomas, watching everything, pulled out his phone. His hands trembled, but he hit record. The camera captured it all. My movements, the passion in every touch, the intimacy that was the ultimate betrayal. He didn't burst into the room. Instead, he kept his composure, returned to the bedroom, and sent the video to Jason's girlfriend. Along with it, he wrote, "Your boyfriend isn't just a liar, but a traitor." Within minutes, he saw the notification. Message read. Her silence spoke louder than any words. Thomas lay back on the bed, feeling anger and pain merge into one. He knew this was only the beginning. His revenge was far from over. The silence in the room was suffocating. I lay beside Jason, feeling the warmth of his breath and the crushing weight of my own choices. Everything seemed frozen, protecting us in a fragile bubble of denial, but that illusion shattered in an instant. The door burst open with a sharp noise and I turned abruptly. Thomas stood in the doorway. His face wasn't filled with rage, but with an icy calm that was far more terrifying. The tension in the air was palpable, leaving no space to escape. My heart raced uncontrollably, pounding so hard it drowned out all other sounds. Thomas stepped inside, his eyes darting between me and Jason, as if trying to confirm the betrayal he had already witnessed. He stopped in the center of the room. The atmosphere grew heavier with his restrained fury. His gaze, brimming with pain and disdain, finally settled on me. No words were needed. I knew he had seen everything we had tried to hide. He approached the bed, his movements sharp and deliberate, like a man on the verge of breaking. But instead of shouting, his voice came out cold and even. Each word was like a knife, cutting through the air. He laid out my betrayal piece by piece, recounting the years we'd built together, the trust I had destroyed, the shame I had brought into our lives. I sat silently, unable to meet his eyes. Each word landed like a blow, leaving me no space to defend myself. He didn't spare Jason either, his accusations laced with the kind of contempt only a brother could express. Time seemed to slow to a standstill. The years of my life with Thomas collapsed under the weight of his anguish and fury. He reminded me of all the trust I had shattered, the bond I had torn apart, and the irreparable damage I had caused. When he finally stopped, the room descended into a suffocating stillness. I dared to glance up, but his expression was distant, as if he were looking right through me. His decision was final. Thomas declared that he wanted a divorce, his voice devoid of emotion, firm and resolute. Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, leaving Jason and me in the oppressive silence that felt even heavier now. I remained motionless, unable to move. Thomas's words echoed in my mind, relentless and sharp. Everything was destroyed, and now I was left to face the weight of the choices I had made. After that evening, everything fell apart. Jason was left alone. The video Thomas had sent to his girlfriend did its job. Their relationship ended as abruptly as it had begun. She refused to listen to his explanations. To her, he wasn't just a traitor, but a stranger, someone unworthy of trust. Thomas, too, severed all ties with him. Their rare conversations, once filled with brotherly warmth, turned into cold silence. Jason tried to defend himself, but all he received in return was emptiness. He had lost not only the woman he loved, but also his only brother. I was left alone in the house. Thomas packed his things and left without a word. His departure was swift, precise, like a scalpel cutting through flesh. The house, once our shared refuge, now felt empty, devoid of life. Each day I woke to silence, surrounded by chaos. There was nothing to hold on to. No familiar morning coffee, no quiet conversations. Thomas had taken not just his belongings, but the stability that once seemed eternal. Soon the fallout spread further. The video Thomas had sent to Jason's girlfriend didn't remain a private tragedy. It began to circulate. Colleagues, acquaintances, people I once respected, now looked at me with judgment. I saw it in their eyes, heard it in their whispers, which grew louder whenever I entered a room. My life seemed to be crumbling before my eyes. I was losing not just the respect of those around me, but pieces of myself. I saw my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman I had become. At some point, I decided I had to try speaking with Thomas. I rehearsed words that might explain everything, but when I finally faced him, all those words vanished. His gaze was cold, his eyes empty. He listened in silence, but there was no trace of understanding in his expression. "This changes nothing," he said quietly when I finished. His voice sounded as though he were speaking to a stranger. Those words crushed any lingering hope I had. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone among the ruins of my life. The divorce papers arrived a few weeks later. Thomas acted decisively, refusing any meetings or conversations. He avoided me even through mutual acquaintances, doing everything he could to erase me from his life. I knew he had already begun a new chapter, one where I no longer had a place. The house once ours felt cold and empty. The rooms filled with memories now seemed foreign. Every object reminded me of what I had lost, not just a husband, but the stability and certainty of a future. Jason didn't stay either. He packed his belongings and left, leaving a brief note of apology. I wasn't surprised. His presence here no longer made sense. Thomas would never forgive him, and our fleeting affair had left nothing but ruins for everyone. I was alone. Days blurred into a monotonous flow, where the silence of the house became my only companion. I often sat in the empty living room, staring at the walls, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong. My thoughts kept returning to the past, replaying the moments that had led me here. I realized the full depth of my betrayal, but couldn't understand how I had allowed it to happen. My solitude became a heavy burden, one I couldn't escape. Life around me continued. I watched neighbors leave in the mornings and return in the evenings, children playing in the yard as if nothing had changed. But for me, the world had stopped. One day, sitting on the porch steps, I looked at the house. Sunlight spilled across the windows, illuminating it as though everything were still the same. But I knew it was just an illusion. I asked myself if there was any chance to fix things. Could I rebuild my life? Or would I forever stand at this threshold, staring at what had been destroyed? There was no answer. Silence was my only reply.